Hey guys, this is David Barton. You can hear me on Bott Radio every weekday at 5:30. Really appreciate the Bott Network and all they do, and I'm just pleased to be part of it. Tonight in Springfield, we covered a lot of ground related to some of the things occurring right now, particularly around protest, the inequality, the racial issues that have come up, the statues that have been torn down, and went back and actually looked at some of the background of what's going on. What is and is not being taught in school, what is and is not appearing on the media, what's accurate and what's not. And it really leads to a narrative quite different from what most of us hear. While we hear that so many statues are coming down because of racism and inequality, there's actually a lot of statues that have come down of abolitionists. There's a lot of statues of Jesus Christ that have come down and of missionaries that have come down, a lot of churches that have been attacked and defaced. There's Bibles being burned, there's 10 Commandments being torn down, and then founding fathers. Just about anyone from the founding era, even if they were a civil rights leader, even if they were anti-slavery, they're coming down. Military statues everywhere coming down. Civil War Union statues in World War I and World War II. So it really has been a narrative that supposedly was about racial injustice, which has existed and still does exist as long as people are out there, but the narrative is more about destroying America. And so when you look back to what we're being told that is not historically accurate, that's part of what we covered tonight. And so some pretty amazing things on a lot of heroes that we just don't talk about anymore. How many black heroes we had in the American founding, how many blacks early on were elected to office we never hear about today, the great cooperation that existed between blacks and whites throughout most of American history. Some examples, particularly in the South, would be different, but that's the exception, not the rule. And so there was a lot of positive things, but also a lot of challenge to learn how to think, that we need to examine things for ourselves. We're so used to just hearing things and repeating them that the challenge really was find out if it's true or not. Find truth, confirm truth, and then defend truth once you know it. So that's what we covered tonight in Springfield.
I think it was about 35 years ago was my first acquaintance with David Barton. I was actually sitting under this balcony when we had pews there. Do you remember that, coming to High Street? I think David Cavan was still the pastor here. And I believe your first book was The Myth of Separation. Was that correct? Something like that. I still have that on a bookshelf. Since then, I've been able to sit under his teaching at least 7 or 8 times. And if you have not heard David Barton before tonight, you are in for a thrill. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is hold on to your seats and listen fast, because I don't know that anyone talks faster than him and packs in more in a minute than he does. David Barton is known as is America's historian. Tonight he's going to present some things that are going to relate history, both past and present, and talk about how it relates to the Bible as well. So would you help me welcome America's historian, Mr. David Barton.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate that, brother. I want to cover, as Mike said, things that are going on in the culture right now, also from a historical standpoint. But having said all that, with everything that's going on, whether it's COVID, whether it's protests and statues, whether it's Supreme Court nominees, doesn't matter. The biggest problem we have in America right now tends to be a problem with truth. And truth is under attack in a way that we have not seen before. Let me get this going. It's under attack in a way that we've not seen in our lifetime. Truth is, I don't use melodramatic hyperbole, but really truth is on life support. And I don't mean that, again, as something melodramatic. I mean that because statistically where we are. When you look at the people right now, 3 out of 5 Americans say there is no absolute moral truth. Now, do you know it's impossible to have a nation continue when you can't get a majority to agree on what's right and wrong? Right now, we have 60% of Americans that think that there is no absolute right or wrong. You cannot survive as a nation with that. When you look at the next generation, millennials, for example, they are everything in the future. They're our future medical people and political people. They're our future scientists. They're our future pastors. They're our future media. They're our future everything. With them, it's 4 out of 5 that believe there is no absolute moral truth. But at least Christians are here, and it's 1 out of 2 with Christians. I mean, this is amazing stuff that Christians, 50% of Christians think there's no, what are the 10 Commandments? Maybe the 10 suggestions is what they are. They should be commands. They're God's word. They're absolutes. So where we find ourselves now is unlike any other time in American history. We've never had polling that has been like this. And so when you look at where we are, we're at a point where that objective truth really does not matter anymore. Objective truth doesn't matter in area after area. You can take the area of gender. 10 years ago, we all knew that there were two genders, and it had been that way for 5,500 years, 5,800 years. Now, as of 3 years ago, we stopped counting at over 90 genders. We're not sure how many there are because you get to define your gender the way you want to. But it's somewhere north of 90. Even Facebook, I think, still has 74 genders you can choose for your profile. So we're confused about gender. We're confused about religion. This is particularly true with Christians in America. As you look at Christians in America right now, the numbers are actually falling dramatically. Just in the last 10 years, we've dropped almost 20% in the number of Americans who profess to be Christians. So Christianity is on its way down, and that's because there's so many other choices you can have. You can make so many other choices. Christians, 80% of Christians believe that religions other than Christianity will get you into heaven. Now, that's a theological impossibility from Christian theology, but nonetheless, 80% of Christians think that another religion will get you into heaven. Specifically, 52% of Christians believe that a belief in Islam will get you into heaven. 53% believe that a belief in Hinduism. Now, these are Christians. We're not talking about national numbers. We're talking about Christian numbers. 53% of Christians. We have 42% of Christians believe that a belief in atheism will get you into heaven. Now, I find that amazing. I don't believe in God, but I'm going to spend eternity with Him. I'm not sure how that works out. But 42% believe that atheists will have a place in heaven. 56% believe that a belief in no religion at all will get you to heaven. You're just a nice person and you're going to heaven just because you're a person. So we as Christians no longer believe anything significant about Christianity, which is why the numbers are plummeting, because we can choose anything we want to believe. We have not only that, but with government, we now see that all forms of government are equal. Communism used to be a bad form of government, not anymore. It's good if you like it, if that's what you want to try. It's never worked in the history of the world, nor has socialism, nor has any of the other stuff. But we now believe that anything's acceptable. If you like it, that's fine. I'm not going to tell you that it won't work. I'm not going to say it's bad. If you like it, that's great for you. We have the same difficulty with education. We used to have standardized tests in America. We had tests like the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, the California Achievement Test, the Stanford Achievement Test. And with those standardized tests for the entire nation, we could compare states one with another. We could say, hey, Texas, my state, 47 out of 50 and whatever. We don't do that anymore. Every state now creates their own standards for the state, and that way we avoid comparisons with other states, and our state looks really good. For example, in my state of Texas, we have schools that we call exceptional schools. And your school is exceptional if 60% of the kids at that school can read. 60% used to be a failing grade when I was in school, and now 60% can read, and that makes you exceptional. But see, we want to feel good about school and education, so we don't have the comparative tests we used to have with education. Rights and wrongs, kind of as you saw in the polls, anything we want to choose. When it comes to history, we just cancel what we don't like. If we disagree with it, we'll just wipe it out. When it comes to science, we can all look at the same scientific data and come up with completely opposite views, because here's what I believe. Really don't care what you believe. What does the science show? Well, here's what I believe about what the science shows. So we now have so many, again, statistical findings in science that get interpreted on opposite ends because we don't believe there's absolute truth. Same with economics. Economics, just look at socialism. Right now in America, 75% of college students say they support socialism, 69% of millennials say they support it, and 42% of Americans say they support it. Now, the problem is, in 5,800 years of history, it's never worked in any nation that's ever tried it. You cannot show me a nation that has gone to socialism that has maintained individual freedom and national prosperity. That those things don't go together. The Bible is very clear against socialism. 1 Timothy 5:8, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, other verses on that. But again, we're into this thing of, well, it's okay if I want to do it. We have the same difficulty with ethics. We could just kind of choose our ethics, whatever they are. There's an ethics committee in the House of Representatives. I'm not really sure what they do because ethics are so opposite from side to side. So, I mean, things are just more confused now than they've ever been in American history. So what's happened is truth and fact is now replaced by personal opinion. We're at a point in time that as Christians, we have to rediscover, recultivate, and rekindle a love for the truth in a very genuine way. There's a Bible verse I'm going to share with you out of 2 Thessalonians 2 that I think is very clear for what's happening right now in America. 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 through 12, talks about the man of lawlessness and the man of truth. And it talks about the conflict that goes between lawlessness and truth. And on it goes. And you get to verse 10, 11, and 12, and there's a sequence that shows, after 9 verses discussing the conflict between truth and lawlessness, in verse 10, the scripture says, they did not receive the love of the truth. Okay, so since they didn't love the truth above all things, they rejected the love of the truth. Because they did not receive a love of the truth, it says, for this reason, God will send them a strong delusion. Notice we're developing a sequence here. You didn't love truth, so here comes a delusion. And it says, and they will believe the lie. And as a result, it says in verse 12 that all might be damned who believe not the truth. Now, damned is a King James word for condemned or judge. But notice how the sequence runs here. It's a fairly clear sequence. You start off by saying, I don't believe that's true. I don't love truth. I reject that truth. I don't agree with it. If you reject the truth, the next thing is a delusion will enter. When the delusion enters, you will believe a lie. When you believe a lie, you will act on that lie, and as a result, there'll be a high cost and consequences to what you do. You can disagree with it, but that's just the way certain laws are. Let me give you an example of that. Let me take something like science. If you take science, I was a math and science teacher for a number of years, principal of a school. And in math and science, we have laws, like the laws of gravity. And it is not an opinion. It literally is a law. It's not somebody's opinion. And a law is something that never once in the history of the world has it ever been violated. It works every single time. Now, below that, things that work 90% of the time, or 80 or 70 or 60, you have theorems and axioms and principles. But if it's a law, it means it has never been violated. It is that way 100% of the time. So you have the laws of thermodynamics. You have the laws of gas pressures. You have the laws of motion. You have all these different kind of laws, the laws of gravity. Those are things that have never been violated. But living in the culture that I do now, I heard President Trump at the Republican convention say it's time for us to put an American on Mars and it's time for us to put a woman on the moon. And I've got some of the spacewalkers that walked on the moon are friends. We have a legislative conference every year in Texas for state legislators, and this year, one of the guys speaking to us is Charlie Duke. He walked on the moon. He's one of only 16 guys to set foot on the moon, and he is so up to speed on the technology, what's happening with the Space Force, with the Discovery missions that are going right now that we don't even hear about. It's just amazing to see. And because of all the technology that has come to bear, you have, when they landed on the moon with Apollo 11, you have more technology in your smartphone right now than they had in the entire space program when they landed on Apollo 11, just in your phone. It's amazing how far we've come. So really, because of how far we've come, I don't think the law of gravity really holds the way that it used to. It's just, I just don't believe that. I reject it, as a matter of fact. And because I reject the law of gravity, there is no law of gravity, which means that it doesn't affect me. And since it doesn't affect me, I can do what I want to do. And I've always wanted to be able to jump off a building and soar. That's been my life goal forever. And I'm going to try it. And when I do, I will soar all the way to my death. I will die. And it really doesn't matter how sincere I am in my beliefs. See, if I reject the truth, a delusion will enter. I'll believe a lie, I will act on the lie, it will have consequences that affect me individually, me personally. And again, it doesn't matter how sincere I am, how genuine I am, how much of a good person I am, it's still going to be the law that works. That's the way God established it, and that's the way it is in the natural world and the spiritual world. It just really doesn't matter what my truth is. There are laws that will work every time, regardless of what my opinion is. If I take this from the area of science and go into faith for a minute, when you look at faith, we have some very clear scriptures in the Bible. You have John 14:6. Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now that's Jesus, and that is a claim of exclusivity. He said, nobody gets to heaven except through me. I'm the only way you get to heaven. Now, that's a spiritual law that God has put out, that Jesus has put out. We're also told in Acts 4:12, it says there's no salvation in anyone else. There's no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Again, exclusivity. This is the only way
of getting to heaven. It's the way that God himself ordained. It's his world. He can do it how he wants to. He's the only one that can suspend laws when he wants to and do what he wants because he made all the laws. So the Creator has the ability and the power to suspend them. But he said, here's the deal. Nobody gets to heaven except through Jesus. Now, with that claim of exclusivity, that there is only one way, I've got to tell you, I really have trouble with that because I know a lot of really, really nice people who aren't Christians. Matter of fact, I know a lot of people who aren't Christians who are nicer than a lot of Christians I know. I know some Muslims who are nicer than a lot of Christians. I know people from all sorts of religions much, much better, much nicer than Christians. So I just really reject that claim of exclusivity. I just don't think it really applies anymore because there are such great people out there. Again, we've got the same sequence. There's no exclusive way to heaven, which means I can pick the way that I want to go, and there's lots of choices I can make. So I can pick the way that I want to go to heaven, and if I do, I will end up in hell. Because the law is there's only one way to go to heaven. The spiritual law is there's only one way to get there, and it doesn't matter how sincere I am. My truth just doesn't impress God at all. He's got his truth, and that's the standard by which we measure, but we live in a culture that rejects absolutes if we disagree with them. And again, even Christians, 1 out of 2 Christians rejects absolute moral truth. So this is what we're dealing with, is personal truth. And so in the concept of personal truth, notice the sequence again. If you reject absolute truth, delusion enters. When delusion enters, you'll believe a lie. When you believe a lie, you'll act on the lie. And when you act on the lie, there will always be high costs and consequences. And it does not matter how small or how big the lie is. It's that way. Well, that's just a little lie. Yeah, but it still has consequences too. Every lie you believe diminishes your life to that degree because it's not truth. Truth is the only thing on which to establish anything. So that's the basis. Now, having said that, this is why I say we are in a period of American history where we have to cultivate, nurture, and grow a love of the truth. We've not had to do this in previous generations. Truth used to matter. It mattered what was in textbooks. It mattered what came out of political officials' mouths. It mattered what came out of judges' mouths. It mattered what came out of teachers' mouths. Truth, we just felt bad if we weren't telling something that was true. Not today. And so that's why it is so difficult to distinguish truth from fiction, because you have such a cacophony of voices talking at the same time, all with opposite opinions, and they can't all be right. And so we have to distinguish, and we've not done a good job of training rising generations to distinguish how to know the truth. One of the things we do in the summer is we take 18 to 25-year-old students that are in college, they're going into college or they're in their graduate work, and we do training for them 2 weeks at a time because we know it's taught in college. I've been involved in colleges, speak at colleges. We have 6 speakers at WallBuilders. Tim, my son, is really popular on colleges, and so we know it's out there. We hear all the time. Students communicate with us, and so we do a lot of apologetics training. How do you identify, how do you know the truth? What is the truth? How can you verify it? How can you know what it is when you hear it in science, when you hear it in government and law and politics and religion and morality and economics? There is truth. How do you identify it? So this is one of the things that we're really teaching the next generation. And by the way, I've never had so much fun in my life. I've never seen so many kids get turned on to truth and become warriors in a really, really good sense. Every single year we've done this, we've had these kids go back and convert professors as a result. And it's not because they go back and confront their professor and tell them how stupid they are, because we tell them, don't challenge that way. What you do is exactly what Jesus did, because you see, in the Gospels, Jesus asked questions 300 times, more than 300 questions he asked. And if you look, he didn't answer many questions at all. He asked a lot because it made you think. I had never thought of that. I didn't realize it. I didn't. And so what happens is these kids, we train them how to ask questions. They start asking questions to their professors. The professors soon get in a position where they said, that's not very logical, is it? It doesn't make sense. No, it doesn't. And so we've seen them change, and you don't have to confront, because if a student confronts a professor's going to step on them every time. They're going to make sure the professor wins. I mean, that's just what they're going to do. They can't control the class if they can't. So again, this goes to thinking, because in the 1920s, prior to the 1920s, American education taught you how to think. Now it teaches you how to learn. Prior to the 1920s, there was no such thing as a true-false test, a multiple-choice test, a fill-in-the-blank test. But that's part of learning, because we want you to learn what the teacher has. So did the teacher say A, B, C, or D? Did the teacher say this, true or false? Teacher said fill in the blank. What we do, that's where indoctrination comes from. You don't learn to think. You just take whatever somebody else gives you as food and you ingest it. And that's why Jesus says in Luke 6:40, every student, when he's fully trained, will be like his teacher. What we're seeing with the protests, what we're seeing with so many other things in polling, this is a result of what's been taught in the classroom for the last several decades, and truth is not part of what's being taught. How to discern, identify, recognize, cultivate, and enjoy truth is not there. So, having said that, from a Christian standpoint, we have a good starting place for truth. Jesus tells us in John 17:17, he says, sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. That's a good starting place. The Bible. This is God's word. That is a starting place for truth. We're also told, the verse I showed you earlier, John 14:6, Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and life. In the person of Jesus Christ, you also have truth. So in the person of Jesus and in God's word, you have truth. And we're told in John 8:31 and 8:32, Jesus said, if you continue in my word, then you'll be my disciples, then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, I hear people all the time quoting the axiom, you know the truth will set you free. ESPN quotes that all the time. No. If you continue in his word, then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. It's not that you know the truth and get set free. It's if you continue in his word, then you've got a standard for recognizing the truth. Once you can recognize the truth, if you embrace the truth, it will set you free. But you have to have some objective standard. And that's why I said, if you continue in my word. So that's what he says about the word. And this is where we have difficulty as Christians today. National polling as of this year, only 9% of Christians read the Bible on a daily basis. Now, you saw the stat earlier where that 65% of Americans claim to be Christians. So 9% of the 65% is the nation basis, which means only 6% of Americans read the Bible on a daily basis. In other words, only 1 out of 16 spend any time in God's Word, and it's not surprising, therefore, that only 6% of Americans have a biblical worldview. Only 1 out of 16 Americans sees things the way that God sees things. Already I showed you Christians. 80% of Christians believe that you can get to heaven other than through Jesus Christ. 47% of Christians believe that Jesus sinned while he was here on earth. I mean, all these things that are theologically impossible, we now believe because that's just what we believe. This is the standard. You got to go back to God's Word. So going back to God's Word, this is where, if you don't, the supremacy of personal opinion comes. Because if you're not going to use God's standard, why not make my own? And that's what we do. So not thinking God's word, not thinking the way God wants us to, that's what we get stuck with. Now, from that background, let me take us into what's happening in the news. And specifically in the news, where I want to start is with statues. What's happening with statues going about 5 months now. Started back end of March, thereabouts. And one of the first statues to come down was statues of Christopher Columbus. Now, Christopher Columbus is, again, one of the first statues to come down. They started tearing down his statues about 6 years ago. And so since this thing has started, it's really kind of accelerated to amazing amounts. And so you look at statues of Columbus, and you see them coming down. And the question would be, why do we take down statues of Columbus? And the answer is, if you'll just get online and do a search of some kind, you'll instantly find all the memes explaining why we take Columbus down. For example, on the left, I don't always celebrate enslavement and genocide, but when I do, it's Columbus Day. Okay, so Columbus Day is about celebrating enslavement and genocide because that's what Columbus did. Actually, we're told that Columbus is the first sex trafficker in the history of the world, that he's the one who introduced the concept of sex trafficking, and he practiced it highly in his voyages. You also have memes like this one, Savage. Stop genocide, racism, and imperialism. Stop the celebration, create hope for a new world. You can't celebrate this guy because he's a savage with genocide and racism and imperialism. And that's why the statues are coming down. So statue after statue of Columbus is being attacked, being damaged, being defaced, being pulled down, beheaded, whatever you want to say. But here's the interesting thing about Columbus statues. Columbus arrived here over 500 years ago. And since then, there have been 600 statues erected to Columbus. Now, can you name anyone else who had 600 statues erected to them? I can't. He has more than anybody I know. So, this generation is tearing down Columbus statues, which implies that every previous generation for the last 500 years that raised those 600 statues, did not oppose sex slavery. They did not oppose genocide. They did not oppose racism. They did not oppose the savagery. They tolerated it. They even celebrated it because they raised him. That doesn't make much sense historically, because we know that there have been all sorts of Christian efforts and Christian leaders who spoke against those practices from way back in Old Testament times. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that they would have been silent when all these statues were being raised. So what's the story? Maybe there's more to it than what we know today. As a matter of fact, a good way of saying it is what's the history, but because of what we're talking about tonight, the real question is, what is the truth about Columbus? And the truth about Columbus is interesting. It starts with, I just ask young people often, and it doesn't matter about whether it's young people or old people now, because anybody has not seen the kind of stuff that is out there. And I'll start by saying, how many voyages did Columbus make? I don't know, and it didn't make any difference because he was a racist on all of them. No. If you don't know how many voyages he made, then you don't have the slightest clue about his story, and you have no basis from which to judge his story except what somebody else has told you in a meme or a soundbite. You see, Columbus made 4 voyages, and on the 4 voyages that he made, they kept meticulous records. He kept journals, he kept diaries, he kept memoirs. So did the 2,000 or so people that went on those 4 journeys with him. They all kept records. As a matter of fact, back in the 1830s, an American diplomat by the name of Washington Irving, who was a great literary figure as well, wrote literature stuff, he was assigned to be the ambassador to Spain. And while he was in Spain, he went into the original archives in Spain and went through all the diaries and writings of Columbus and his crew and his men and the doctors and the settlers and others. And he came out with a 3-volume set called The Life of Christopher Columbus, one of the most exhaustive pieces ever done on Columbus. We own about 120,000 documents from before 1812, so on thousands of the original handwritten documents of founding fathers, others. We own the second piece that was ever done on Columbus. It was done by his son. His son collected his father's writings and published those, and so we have the diaries and the other things as well. So there's a lot of information out there to tell us what went on in those voyages. And if you start with the voyage, the first voyage was the one where he landed in the New World. This is the painting that hangs inside the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. It's been hanging there. It's a 14-foot high painting. It's 20 feet wide. It's a massive life-size painting, Columbus landing in the Western world. When he landed there, the records tell us that the tribe he encountered were known as the Taínos. And he met the Taínos, and that was the first encounter for both of them with a native tribe or with an Anglo guy. And things went really well. As a matter of fact, Columbus says, these are the kindest and gentlest people, a better people there could not be. And he wrote the King and Queen of Spain and said, these people need to be part of the Spanish Empire. They need all the rights of citizenship. They need our protection. These are great people. These are, what an addition for the Spanish Empire to have people of this quality. So he has good relations with those people, but the Taínos said, really glad you like us, but you really need to know there's another tribe here, and they're our enemies, and they won't like you at all. As a matter of fact, they're cannibals. They were called the Caribs and the Cannibs. And Cannibs is where we get the word cannibal, and Carib is where we get the word Caribbean. And so the Taínos said, you really need to watch out for this other tribe. We're fine. We're getting along great. But this other tribe, they are cannibals. As a matter of fact, they kill and eat us. We supply the food for them. They go island after island throughout the Caribbean, completely depopulating it. They'll move onto an island and live there until they eat everyone. When everyone's gone, then they move on to the next island. So they go across the Caribbean doing this. Well, Columbus did not believe them. He said, come on, guys, this is 1492. In this enlightened world, somebody's going to be eating somebody in 1492? Never happened. So Columbus just blew it off. It's not happening. But because he's created good relations with the Taino, he says, I'm going back to Spain. I'm going to get more supplies. We're going to bring back over here. What a great place to live. And so as they start to head out, one of his ships runs aground. That ship that ran aground, it damaged it so badly that it was not going to be able to return to Spain. But the guys that were there, he said, guys, we'll build a fort for you guys here. You just stay here. It's going to be great. The Taínos are here. They love us. We get along great with them. And it's going to be a short trip. I'm just going there, loading up and coming back. I'll be back really quick. So you guys got the fort. You just hang here. I'll be back shortly. So Columbus sails back to Spain, which is his first journey. He then turns back around to come with the supplies. And while he's gone, after he leaves, the Cannibs show up. And they attack Columbus's guy guys and they kill them and they cannibalize them. And the first thing they cannibalize is eyeballs. They love to scoop out the eyeballs and eat them. And as they were eating some of the men, the Tainos came up and drove them off. They fought the cannibals and tried to get them off of Columbus's guy, but all of Columbus's guys were dead and they were in the process of being cannibalized. So what happens is when Columbus gets back, he heard what had happened to his men. And hearing what had happened to his men, and the Tainos said, these are the guys we told you about. These are the guys you didn't believe. This is what they just did. Your men are proof of that. Columbus says, okay, I'm going to go find the cannibals. And so he goes looking for the cannibals. And as he does, he, in one of the islands, comes onto cannibal villages, but the cannibals aren't there. They're out depopulated another island at the time. He gets there and he finds 50 huts full of Taino women. And he looks at the Taino women and said, what are you doing over here? They said, well, we've been kidnapped. We're the sex slaves for the cannibals. They rape us, and all the children we produce, they eat. We're their food factory, so we produce food for them to eat. And the women explained to Columbus and said that the cannibals, they don't like to eat young boys or children or women. They like to eat infants, and they like to eat full-grown. And so they told Columbus, and this is recorded by one of the doctors who was with Columbus, who recorded what the women said. He said, when the cannibals take any boys as prisoners, they remove their organs, fatten the boys until they grow to manhood, and then when they wish to make a great feast, they kill and eat them, for they say the flesh of boys and women is not good to eat. So, and by the way, they confirmed that. Columbus's guys confirmed all the human bones they found laying around the camp and all it's just barbaric. Well, Columbus does find the Tainos. He liberates the women. He finds the cannibals. And so when he finds the cannibals, they get into a major fight. He and the cannibals get into this fight because they killed his guys. They're killing all of his friends. They're depopulating all the other native tribes in the islands. And so he attacks them. And it's interesting. This is what's called the Age of Conquest at that point in time. In the Age of Conquest, there's only two options of what you can do when you fight an enemy. You can either kill that enemy or you can enslave that enemy. That's it. And that's because the cultures were so polarized at that time, there's no middle ground. I mean, what are you going to do with the cannibals? Say, hey guys, you really shouldn't be cannibals, so let's kind of wean you off that. I tell you what, you just eat people on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, not the other days of the week. No, stop it. You're so screwed up, you got to stop. So this is what God told the children of Israel when they went into Canaan. I said, in the land of Canaan, they said, they are so messed up. They sacrifice their children. They burn people. Said, just wipe them out. See, when you get to a culture that's that opposite, you go in and you say, we got to wipe them out. That's the only way to stop the damage they're doing. Now, it's interesting. We did that about 4 years ago. We had a culture that was so twisted, that was so goofed up. What they did publicly, what they did in the way of barbarity and executions of the most harmless people, it was just unbelievable. So after 4 years, they're pretty much wiped out. Now, ISIS still exists, but they've largely moved into Africa. They're out of the Middle East now. There are remnants that still hold the belief, but ISIS as a body is not there. The caliphate has been destroyed from that standpoint. And nobody accused America of genocide for having wiped out as much of ISIS as we could. And somehow we accused Columbus of wiping out the ISIS. What Columbus did was he saved so many other native tribes. He saved so many other people, including his own. And as a matter of fact, if you've ever been on a Caribbean cruise, I bet none of you had to worry about cannibals when you got there. You know, he made the whole world better, and somehow we're taking him down for all this nonsense. So that's the end of his second trip. And on that trip, as he's going back to Spain, a number of Tainos came to him and said, we want to go back with you. We want to meet this king and queen you keep talking about. And so he takes them back to Spain, and they actually became part of the royal court in Spain. But as Columbus went back, he took some surviving cannibals with him, and he said to the king and queen, these guys actually eat people. They ate my people. It's like you won't. He shows the king and queen what's over there and how barbaric the place is. So that's the story behind it, and somehow that makes him into a sex trafficker, which he never did. It was the cannibals who were the sex traffickers, and it makes him into someone who practices enslavement. No, He brought a couple of slaves back to show, here's what these guys are like. I mean, he took them on in justified war. So the real story is really quite different, but that's not the end of the story. There's more to it. Because what we also hear today is that Columbus was motivated by gold. He did not only did he get into sex trafficking and slavery, not only was he a genocidal maniac that wiped out entire races of people, he did it for money. He loved money. And so what if there's more to that part of the story, just like there was the other part? And to understand whether there's more to this part of the story, you got to know what was happening at that time in world history. And it deals with the Crusades. Now, the Crusades, we teach this in every American textbook I've ever seen, and we should. It's part of world history. But there's 3 questions you should always be able to answer with the Crusades. And with the Crusades, you need to know who's involved, where did they occur, and why did they occur. Now, very few textbooks I've seen cover those 3 things, and it's important. Let me go to where they occurred. These are the Christian Crusades, and the textbooks tell us this is where the Christians attacked and killed all these helpless people, and this is the barbarity of Christians. And the textbook, the world geography, the world history and world geography textbook used in a lot of states right now has 19 pages on the glories of Islam and 3 pages on the atrocities of Christianity. And so there's atrocities of Christianity. The Crusades, there were some 13 to 17 Crusades that occurred. And if you see, they're over in the Middle East area. So all throughout the Middle East, those 3 up in Turkey, that's part of the 7 churches in the book of Revelation. This is where, from the ministry of Jesus and the apostles, this is where Christianity had really started growing in the world, was the Middle East, and then out into Turkey, and from Turkey over into Italy, and Italy into Spain, as Paul made his missionary journeys. So these 13 to 17 Christian crusades that occurred, but who were they fighting? They were fighting Muslims. It's interesting that when you look at the Muslim crusades actually involved 548 different crusades. Now, compare that to the 17 of Christians. I've never seen a textbook cover the 548 of the Muslims. I've seen them cover how bad the Christians are. Nothing about what happened to the Muslims. As it turns out, Muslims were attacking anywhere that Jews and Christians lived to take it back from them because they're the infidels and they have to be conquered. And so if you look at where the hot spots are, you see up here, that's Italy. That's where Paul went. That's the church at Rome. The book of Romans is there. The Christian church there. This is where Columbus lived. Columbus lived in a country that was regularly being attacked by Muslim conquerors and invaders to kill the Christians. Columbus, as a young boy, actually was in part of those crusades trying to defend his country from all these Muslim attacks. Well, he then starts sailing for Spain, for the king and queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabel. And look at Spain. Oh my gosh, that's a hot spot. Are they under attack? Yeah, they're under attack. And notice the other hot spot is right down here in the Middle East, because this is where Jews and Christians were. All the early Christians were Jews. I mean, this is both religions. That's where it is, right there in the Holy Land. And so what happens, and by the way, if you know much about Islamic history, when they conquer a people, what they'll do is they erect a minaret there and a mosque. They put a mosque there with a high tower, and that shows that they've conquered an area, which is why so many people got ticked off when they wanted to build a mosque on the site of 9/11, because this is the traditional. A lot of Americans didn't get what was going on, but this is traditional what happened. So if you've ever been on a trip to the Middle East, to the Holy Land, what you'll see is that at sites like Caesarea is where Paul set out on his missionary journeys. This is a big part of Christian history. It's been conquered. It was a Jewish area, Jewish Christians, and now it's conquered, and so you have a minaret there and a mosque there. Bethlehem, that's the birthplace of King David, and that's the birthplace of Jesus, a favorite of Jews and Christians, and it's now a Muslim city. So is the city of Nazareth, where that Jesus spent his childhood. It is a Muslim city. If you go to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, holy to both Christians and Jews, it is now the 3rd holiest site in Islam. The training centers and the mosques that's there. If you look at Caesarea Philippi, this is where Jesus told the disciples, on this rock I'll build my church, the gates of hell won't prevail. I mean, that's really commissioning of the New Testament church. Big old, there's a mosque built there as they conquered that area. So this is what has been going on. So what happens is, all of this area over there that's been conquered, Columbus is very aware of that as a Christian. As a matter of fact, in his journals, he writes that he had consulted the leading theologians of that day, and he said they all agree that Jesus will return within 155 years. Now, I don't know why 155. You know, every generation seems to have its end-time theology. Their end-time theology said Jesus will be back in 155 years. They missed that by about 350. Nonetheless, they said Jesus will be back. And so Columbus says they all agree he's coming back. We need to raise money to go liberate the Holy Land before Jesus gets back. We need to be able to give it back to him as a holy place of his people, Christians and Jews. And so that's why he asked for money. This is what he told the king and queen. He says, I wish that all the profits of this my enterprise may be sent in the conquest of Jerusalem. He's not after getting a castle that's 43 stories high and having the biggest castle anybody ever had. He wants to get money to go liberate the Middle East and get it from the hands of the Muslim conquerors who have been attacking everything that's out there. That's a little bit of a different story than what we get as well. Don't seem to get that part of the story. So when you look at Columbus, these journals that he had, in addition to journals, he also had what was called his Book of Prophecies. Now, the Book of Prophecies, this is what he did between the third and fourth voyages. In the Book of Prophecies, he was going through every verse in the Scripture, looking and reading. As a matter of fact, he says, I've seen and put in the study to look into all the Scriptures. Our Lord opened my understanding. I could sense his hand upon me. All those who heard about my enterprise rejected it with laughter, scoffing at me. Who doubts that this illumination was from the Holy Spirit? I attest that he, the Spirit, with marvelous rays of light, consoled me through the holy and sacred Scriptures. No one should be afraid to take on any enterprise if in the name of our Savior, if it is right and if the purpose is purely for his service. See, what he did was he went through the Scripture and he tells his Book of Prophecies. He got into Isaiah and the Holy Spirit lit up to him that the light of the gospel has to go to the isles of the sea. He said, the isles of the sea? There's no isles of the sea. And he said, the Holy Spirit's showing me that there's people out there yet undiscovered that need the light of the gospel. He said, my name is Christopher. He said, that means Christ bearer. I'm supposed to be the one that takes the light. So his journeys were actually motivated by missionary purposes, and that's what he writes in his Book of Prophecies as well, that this is for the Holy Spirit. Everybody heard about it, laughed, said he was crazy. You can't do this. He did it. And so things have really changed as a result. So when you see the true story, it's quite different, but we're tearing the statues down. But this goes back to another verse in Proverbs 18:17 that says, one side sounds good until you hear the other. Now see, this is one of the verses on which we have the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution. Actually, Federal Practice and Procedure, the law books for federal practice of attorneys, points out there are two Bible verses that shaped the Sixth Amendment confrontation clause. One is this one, and the other was what Jesus said in John 8:12. You have a right to confront your accuser. Why? Because there's two sides of the story. You see, if the prosecution only got to present his case, we would convict everybody. If defense attorney only got to present their case, we'd release everybody. So both sides presents their cases. The jury says, what's true here? We have to find truth, and that's where you try to get the jury to go. You hear both sides, and see, this is it. We hear one side about Columbus today. When's the last time you've heard the other side about Columbus or anybody stand up and try to defend him? And in this culture, if you stand up and defend him, you will get attacked because they'll think you're crazy, but yet the historical records are really clear. See, we believe that. The other verse I would send you to is Acts 17:11, where that Paul was on his second missionary journey. And Paul, on that missionary journey, talked about how he went to various places, Thessalonica, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is a books written to that church. He said, but when he got to Berea, he said, I love these people in Berea. They were kind of blue-collar kind of folks. He said, those in Berea were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the Scriptures daily to see whether the things I told them were true. He said, I love these guys. They don't believe me until they check it out and see if I was telling the truth. He said, they listen to me, but then they go check the Scriptures themselves to see if I'm dividing the Scriptures the right way. That's the way we're supposed to be. When we hear something, what I'm saying right now, do not believe me. Go back and look up the journals of Columbus. Look up his Book of Prophecies. Look up the accounts of those who went on the voyages. See if it's historically true. For all you know, I'm making it all up. See, that's why Paul loved these guys. I'm the most credentialed apostle out there. I have more PhDs after my name than any of the other guys. I love these people. They don't believe me unless they check it out. Exactly. And that's the way we want to be trained, to find truth, to search truth, to look it up. So that's the thing of hearsay. We get a lot of hearsay today. Where's the evidence? And it doesn't matter what source it comes from. We've got all these different social media and other sources, tickers across the screen that give us breaking news. How do we know? We just ingest it because we're not thinkers. We become learners, and we just take stuff in. So all of that. Now, let's keep moving. So the love of truth is really the most important thing, and applied to statues. When you look at the statues thing, and again, this is about 4.5 months, The statues have been attacked because of the inherent racism that we have in America. So that's why the statues are coming down. And specifically, that's why Confederate statues are coming down. I looked not long ago. I keep a list of all the statues that have come down and monuments been defaced. And I looked online, and the two most immediate sources of the list of statues list all the Confederate statues that have come down and all the racist statues that have come down. And so that justifies tearing these down because they're all racist, except that's really not what's going on. And a great example to show that is, why would you tear down the statue of David Farragut? He is a Union admiral who hated slavery, who fought against the slave nation of the Confederacy because he so hated slavery. Why did you tear his statue down? Because he's not a racist and he's not a Confederate, by the way, nor is Ulysses S. Grant, who's the commander of the Union forces who defeated the Confederacy. So if you're going after the Confederacy, he should be your hero. By the way, when he became president of the United States, he passed 6 civil rights laws, including the first law to punish the Ku Klux Klan. So he ought to be somebody to celebrate. Now we got to tear his statue down. Well, we've also got the Mass 54th. That's the first black regiment in the Civil War era. Frederick Douglass is the one who started that, civil rights leader. He started the Mass 54th, Mass 55th. His 2 sons fought in the Mass 54th. This is a breakthrough military unit. I actually own the law that was passed in Congress that as a result of the victories these guys achieved in defeating the Confederacy, that law says all soldiers in the military, black and white, get same pay, same treatment, equality in the military. They're the guys that achieved it. You ought to be celebrating that. And then we've got Abraham Lincoln statues coming down. I thought he's the guy who ended slavery. And then we've got the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial. Now, this one nobody really knows about, but this goes to my point. These 3 guys right there, 3 black guys, Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGee, these 3 guys in Duluth, Minnesota, were lynched because they were black. They were falsely accused of a crime and just lynched. And so this is a monument, a memorial built to honor the victims of racial injustice. And we got to tear it down too? I thought these guys stood for what you say you're standing for. So we tear that one down. Teddy Roosevelt, he's a racist, except he's the guy who started a major equality movement in 1901. He's the first man to invite black to the White House to eat dinner. He knew what he did would start a riot, and it did. They had riots as a result of him having a black at the White House to eat dinner. And Booker T. Washington, he and Booker T. had to make real decisions about whether they were going to do this because they knew it would start something new, and they knew the reaction would be very violent on the other side. So for the next 3 years, Booker T. Washington, there were hired assassins out to kill him because he went and ate at the White House with the president. And these guys talked about it. It was going to be difficult, but they were going to send a signal. They were not going to put up with inequality. And that's why this poster came out in 1901 called Equality, because that's when Booker T. Washington went to the White House and met with and ate dinner at the White House with Teddy Roosevelt. Now we're taking a statue down because Teddy's a racist. Then we've got Frederick Douglass. Why in the world would his statue come down? Because he is the greatest civil rights leader of the 1800s. He was more photographed than Abraham Lincoln was. And we're tearing his statue. So clearly, this must not be about racism. So why are we tearing these down? Well, it could be that America now is largely historically illiterate. It could be that people don't know who those guys are, and if it's a statue, they got to come down. It could be that, but there could be more to it. It could be more about not only just hating abolitionists, because they say racist, but they're going after abolitionists too. It could involve not just historical literacy, it might involve just flat hating America. And I think this is it. Let me prove to you. Why is it that all the statues of Jesus are coming down? See, the activist says statues of Jesus are a gross form of white supremacy. You don't hear this on the news much, but statues all over the United States of Jesus Christ are being decapitated, attacked, torn down. Here's one in Miami-Dade County. Here's one a week and a half ago in El Paso. Went in and decapitated Jesus, tore that statue down. This is Junipero Serra, Christian missionary. He's the founder of California, brought the gospel to California, started schools there for children, for Native Americans as well. And yet his statues there are all being torn down because he is a Christian missionary, which makes him automatically bad. You also have churches that he founded. The mission churches in California, they're burning those down because he started them and he's a Christian and you can't have guys like that. This is in Connecticut. Church closes after vandals paint satanic symbols on the outside of Connecticut Parish. Over the course of a week, 11 churches were attacked, but this is going on all over the United States, not just Connecticut. You also have burning St. John's Church in Washington, D.C. The first president to have any living time in Washington, D.C. was John Adams. The last 3 months of his presidency was in the White House, brand new city, Washington, D.C. John Adams went to St. John's Church, and every other president in the United States has gone to St. John's Church. That's a church of the presidents. They go after it, and they burn it down. Eventually, the police are able to get in. The rioters wouldn't let them get in to put out the fire, so it really did some serious damage. But they eventually saved the remnants of it, and then the next week, BLM comes back and burns it again. So what's the deal with that? Or why tear down the 10 Commandments in Montana? What does that have to do with racism? And for that matter, why would you burn Bibles in Portland? Why are the rioters going after Christianity so aggressively? But they don't stop there. If you go, oh, by the way, one more Christian memorial to show you, and there's so many I could show you, just don't have time to go through all, but you get the tone. This is the Armenian Genocide Memorial. Now, Armenian Genocide was Christians in Turkey killed by Muslims in World War I. And so there were millions of Christians killed by Muslims in World War I. Actually, one of the more famous photographs from the Armenian Genocide is the fact that the Muslims would crucify young Christian girls. They would just line them up. So this is what was going on. And we're going to tear that memorial up too? Where's the racism here? No, it's not racism. It's the God stuff. It's the Jesus stuff. Again, that's all white supremacy. Jesus and Christianity is white supremacy. You've also got what happened in D.C. with the 12 monuments there that were attacked. President Trump got out the federal forces really quick. He's done a great job of not allowing federal places to be attacked, at least not for 100 days, maybe 3, 4, 5 hours, and then gets a stop put to it. But it's interesting that what you see is the World War I monument in Pittsburgh. What does that have to do with racism? Or the World War I monument in Kansas City? Or the World War I monument in Birmingham? Or the World War II monument in Washington, D.C.? Or the World War II monument in Indiana? Or the World War II monument in Merced, California? This memorial lists all the guys in Merced that gave their life in World War II. We got to deface that. We got to destroy that. You've got the World War II memorial in Charlotte. I mean, why go after Jesus stuff? Why go after the U.S. military? That's not what we're talking about with racism. And why go after the firefighters memorial, the 9/11 memorial? What's that got to do with racism? It doesn't have to do with racism, but it does have to do with hating America. So in addition to not liking abolitionists, we also don't like Christ in the military, but we also don't like the founding fathers. You see, that's why the statue of Caesar Rodney is removed. If you ever get a Delaware quarter, the state quarter's on the back, it's got him on horseback riding. He's the great hero of Delaware, but now he's coming down. He was anti-slavery. He was a big civil rights founding father guy who wanted equality, but he's coming down. You've got Ben Franklin, who started the first abolition society in America, did as an act of civil disobedience against King George III. His statue just came down at Kansas, Washburn Law School. You've got Philip Schuyler, who helped win the first major victory in the American Revolution, the Battle of Saratoga. He's coming down out of New York. You have Casimir Pulaski, a Polish general, Polish man who came here, sided Washington. Washington made him a general. He fought for America so that we could be free, and he's a huge anti-slavery guy. Then you got Thaddeus Kosciuszko, another Polish man who came here. Washington made him a general. He not only fought for America to be free, but he took his entire considerable wealth. He was a count. He took his wealth and put it all into making sure that America would have no slaves and that we could free slaves and then we'd have equality. So he's a huge equality guy. And then you've got Louis the 16th. Why don't you go after him? Because he's the French king that says, go help the Americans. Go help the American Revolution. He's the guy who sent the army and the navy from France. That may be the only victory they ever won in their whole life, but they at least won that one. So France sides, we couldn't have won the American Revolution without France having done that, but we got to deface him because he helped America. Then you've got the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier of the American Revolution. Why would you deface that? So much I can point to. Well, it's because all the founding fathers were racist. That doesn't really hold up. See, the problem we have today is we're historically illiterate about the founding fathers. I was at a black law school not long ago, and I said, these are the 56 guys who founded America, signed the Declaration of Independence. And isn't it unfortunate that America was founded by a bunch of racists and bigots and slave owners? And yeah, it is. I said, by the way, who up there owned slaves? Thomas Jefferson did. Great, you've just given me 1 out of 56. Give me some more. They couldn't give me a second name. I said, so you're telling me that because one of them owned slaves, they're all racists and bigots and slave owners? And see, I can just start going across that left side there. The guy looking out toward us is Benjamin Harrison. Beside him, the three guys sitting in a row, Richard Henry Lee, Sam Adams, George Clinton. The guy looking backwards the other way is Charles Carroll, the guy with the light brown jacket on the front row, Robert Morris. Beside him is Benjamin Rush. Above him, the guy with the hat is Stephen Hopkins. To his right is William Williams. Down below, the guy leaning on his elbow is Elbert Sherry. Beside him is Robert Treat Paine. See, we've never heard those names anymore. Oh, they're all a bunch of racists. No. 3/4 of the Founding Fathers were abolitionists, were anti-slavery. They fought slavery. They freed slaves. So if you want to say part of them were, yeah, let's have that discussion. But to tell me they're all racist, that means you don't know any. That means you're historically illiterate. The other problem we have is we think that what happened with these guys, they're all whites. Yeah. That's because we teach history so bad today. See, we don't talk about Wentworth Cheswell, who was a black man elected to office in New Hampshire in 1768. Great patriot in the American Revolution, made a Paul Revere kind of ride. He was reelected to office in New Hampshire for 49 years, held 8 different political positions. He's the historian of New Hampshire. We rarely hear about John Morant. At the age of 14, became the first black American successfully to evangelize Native Americans. He's part of the American Revolution. We also have Absalom Jones, the first ordained black man in the United States to be ordained in a major denomination. He was part of the American Revolution as well. He was one of the supply corps, the quartermaster. You have William Nell, who's the great black historian, wrote a number of books on all the black patriots in the wars of 1776 and 1812. You have the Battle of Lexington and black patriots like Prince Estabrook. Black patriots and white patriots all went to church together. That Battle of Lexington was Jonas Clark's church of 70 men going out to face 700 British. Black and white guys fighting side by side. They erected monuments to him back in that day. We still have monuments erected to Prince Estabrook today. Nobody's heard his name. We have guys like Lemuel Haynes, soldier in the American Revolution, Minuteman, a black pastor. He pastored white churches all over Vermont and New York and Massachusetts. People loved him. He was a great patriot. In his churches, he would give a sermon on George Washington's birthday about George Washington's commander-in-chief with whom he had served. He's the first black man to receive a degree of higher education in America, first black man to have a sermon published. Just incredible what he did. You have James Armistead, the first double spy in American history. George Washington actually credits his work with helping end the revolution. He cut much off the revolution. Washington and Lafayette both say we wouldn't have ended it the way it would not have ended without James Armistead. He was a huge hero. We've never heard his name, by the way. Hollywood is finally doing 2 movies on the guy. I've been able to do some of the scripts and see what's going on with Hollywood. He's the guy who deserves all sorts of mention. Above him is Peter Salem, the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was given 12 military commendations, presented the commander-in-chief, the great hero. Along with him was another black patriot, Salem Poor, another hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is John Chavez, a breakthrough educator who educated in a segregated state, North Carolina, both black and whites. Matter of fact, he trained most of the U.S. senators and their children in North Carolina. This is Harry Hoosier. Indiana is named the Hoosier State because of his efforts. Most people in Indiana have no clue they're named after a black evangelist. You also have Richard Allen. Richard Allen started the first black denomination in America, part of the American Revolution. You have Benjamin Banneker, Scientific American, did the first black American to have a scientific almanac. He laid out Washington, D.C., surveyed Washington, D.C. You have Jack Sisson, early SEAL team. His remarkable stuff that he did in 1778 and helping capture the second in command of the British. It is stuff that legends are made of. Why don't we hear any of these names? Say why are they all? I would suggest to you that if we taught American history and still showed this, that it was not a white-only effort. It was white and black. We would have a whole different discussion going on across the nation today than what we have. But we don't know our history. How come we don't know our history? Woodrow Wilson. How? In 1902, Woodrow Wilson did a 5-volume history set called The History of the American People. It was considered a breakthrough. It was just amazing. It was so academic. This teacher, man, what he did, it was so important that the next year, Princeton made him president of Princeton University on the basis of that history book that he did. He was the first non-clergyman to be president of Princeton. And then after that, the people looked at him and said, he's done such a good job with history of the American people. He's done such a good job as an educator. He's done such a good job as an academic at Princeton. Let's make him president of the United States. And he did. But when you look at him, it all starts right here in 1902 with this book. Now, this book, fairly interesting because in this book, you find his philosophy come through. Woodrow Wilson is a hardcore racist. When he became president of the United States, every single black person that served in the federal government, he fired them except one so he could have a token black. He is also the guy that brought back the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, the second revival of the Klan. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson. His administration marched openly with the Klan down parades in the street of Washington, D.C., since he helped bring it back. His book that he did, The History of the American People, was the basis of the first Klan recruiting film that was ever done, Birth of a Nation. That came from Woodrow Wilson's book. Matter of fact, he showed that film at the White House to recruit for the Ku Klux Klan. And when that film was shown in theaters across the nation, the Klan was there because they were the ones who saved America. They were the ones who made sure that all these black people trying to store America, it was a Klan film, and it was Woodrow Wilson who did that. So this book right here, it's interesting. He cuts out every single black in American history. There's not a single, not even Frederick Douglass, who is a recent guy, a civil rights. He's not even in the book. The History of the American People has no black people in it. Therefore, if you don't know what a black person looks like, he does show you what one looks like. He's got a picture of one here. If you look, it looks like a monkey, doesn't it? It looks like a gorilla. Now, why did that be? Because as Woodrow Wilson was growing up as a young boy, there was a series of science books that had come out by a guy named Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, if you look at The Origin of Species, now all we say today, we use this book in education days called The Origin of Species. You see it has a longer title? The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Darwin has favored races in evolution? Yeah. As a matter of fact, right after this, he wrote The Descent of Man. The Descent of Man, on 11 occasions, he says, the darker your skin is, the less evolved you are. So blacks need to be sent back to Africa till their skin turns light. Once they're as evolved as we are, then they can come back. Time out. We're canceling Confederate statues because they're racist. How about cancel Darwin? I mean, this is the guy who has that stupid stuff going on. This is hardcore racism. And that's where you get this concept that, well, since they're black, they're more like monkeys. They haven't evolved. We need to send them back. This is the stuff that was behind Woodrow Wilson and what he did. And so that's where black history went. I mean, this is a good guy to cancel right there if you want to. But you don't. You don't cancel history. You learn from the good, the bad, the ugly. I can learn as much from a wicked king like King Ahab as I can from a good king like King David. I can learn from both of them. So that's what's going on. That's why we don't get these. That's why we're historically illiterate, is Woodrow Wilson had a huge impact. So let me see if I can start bringing some of the statue stuff down to a close here. Still a little bit to go. So all this historically illiterate stuff. The other thing we don't teach well is world history. For example, the African slave trade went from 1501 to 1875, 374 years, the African slave trade. Now, the path that it took, 12.7 million slaves were taken out of Africa, distributed across the world. I had a professor recently tell his students, he says, all 12.7 million of those slaves went to America. America is the only nation taking slaves. No, we have the records of all the ships, all the slave ships, how many they carried, how many died. We know that about 2 million died on the transit to the various places they were going. About 10.5 million is what actually made it. We know that 43% of all those slaves went to Portugal and Brazil. I don't think most of us have heard that the number one slave receiving place in the world was Portugal and Brazil. Number 2 is Great Britain at 24%. Number 3 is Spain at 15%. Number 4 is France at 11%. 5 is the Dutch. Look at America, 2.5%. And lower than that was Denmark. America was one of the least receiving nations of the slave trade. Now, doesn't mean we should have received any, but the fact that we're being told today that we received all of them, that if it hadn't been for America, there wouldn't have been a slave trade, that is absolute nonsense. See, we don't even know what happened in the history of the world regarding slavery, nor do we know the fact that of this comparison, it's interesting that every nation in that time had slavery. Do you know that black historian Carter Woodson, the father of Black History Month, recorded that in the 1830 census, that 43% of free blacks in South Carolina had black slaves, that 40% of free blacks in Louisiana had black slaves. Black-on-black slavery was very prominent. White slavery was prominent, particularly Muslims would capture white Americans, take them into slavery in other places. The highest percentage of slave ownership in America was Native Americans. The 5 largest Native American tribes, 12% of their populations were black slaves. They had a rate high, for all of America, it was only 8%, but for Native American tribes, it's 12%. I mean, slavery is everywhere with every people, has been that way from history. So having said all that, did you know that America is the first nation in the history of the world to ban the slave trade? Nobody did it before America did it. We did it in 1807. Did you know that after we banned the slave trade, America assigned a full naval squadron to go sit off the coast of Africa and make sure no slavery got to Africa? We wanted to end slavery in the whole world, so we put the U.S. Navy over in Africa to stop all the other ships that came. And so we would intercept ships, and that was from 1819 until the Civil War started. We would intercept ships that were coming in and keep them from taking slaves out or taking any kind of slave cargo. So, and the British joined us on that, by the way. British did a great job. Great Britain largely tried to prevent slavery all by ourselves. It's interesting that even this is a picture off a British ship in 1900. Slaves were still being taken off ships by the British in 1900. We got out of it at the time of the Civil War. But nonetheless, slave traffic still going a long time after America. America was the 4th nation in the world to ban slavery. There were 124 nations in the world at the time. The first to ban slavery was Great Britain in 1833. Then came, after Great Britain, came France, then Denmark, then America. We banned slavery in 1865. Now, may I point out, we're the 4th in the world to do so. We're in the top 1% of the world's nations in doing so. That means slavery only got banned 150 years ago. The anti-slavery movement is a new movement in the history of the world. Slavery's been out there a long time. Nobody did it before Great Britain in 1833. That's less than 2 centuries ago. People today think we've always hated slavery. We've always been opposed. No, that's a new movement in the world, is the end of slavery. Significantly, when you look at countries today, did you know that 195 nations in the world today, 94 still have not made slavery illegal in their nation? There's 94 nations today where you can still practice slavery. There are currently 40 million slaves in the world today as we sit here tonight. Now, 40 million, that's more than at any time in the history of the African slave trade. I actually help run an organization out of Dallas. We're considered the most active organization in the world in grabbing and snatching slaves, specifically grabbing slaves that are enslaved. When ISIS was there and the Arab Spring was going on, we hired Kurds, and Kurds hate ISIS. They love Christians, hate ISIS. They're Muslims, but they would go in and snatch slaves for us. They would go into ISIS camps and fight ISIS and take the Christian slaves out, because all over the Middle East, when ISIS went in, they made slaves out of Christians and other religious minorities like Yazidis. Our guys went in and took the slaves and brought them back to freedom. Now, 2 of our guys got killed doing that. 1 of our guys was shot 17 times. He keeps coming back. We made another rescue operation last week, freed 12 more slaves. Slavery is all over the world. In Dallas, we get 300 sex slaves a day brought into Dallas. There's 40 million in the world, and we want to gripe about America from 200 years ago and not even look at what's happening today, which, by the way, if you look at 195 nations today, among the global nations, America is ranked number 2 in the world in fighting racism and slavery. Only Netherlands does more than we do. Why don't we tell kids that? See, this is what we're not hearing on the other side of the story. So our historical literacy is really high. So Tim Kaine, U.S. Senator, you may have seen this about 5-6 weeks ago. Tim Kaine on the floor of the U.S. Senate, he said, the United States didn't inherit slavery from anybody. We created it. Sounds just like schools. See, he's only saying what we're saying to the kids. He's only saying what we're telling the protesters. See, we created it. Do you guys remember some book in the Bible called Exodus? You remember what that was about? Oh, that was the Hebrew slaves making an exodus out of Egypt to freedom. I don't think America existed at that time. I could be wrong. I don't think they got slavery from us. See, it's the same thing when you look at things like ancient Greece. 30% of ancient Greece was slaves, and that was before America existed. 40% of ancient Rome was slaves. Do you know that when Columbus landed in the New World, between 20 and 40% of Native Americans enslaved other Native American tribes? So slavery was common among Native American tribes. That was before America. All of this occurred before America was ever established, and yet Senator Kaine tells us we didn't inherit slavery from anybody. We created slavery. So this is the kind of misinformation that's out there. This is what the 1619 Project has picked up on. 1619 Project started in the New York Times. It's joined by Black Lives Matter. It's joined by Antifa. The 1619 Project actually has curriculum. And when you look at the curriculum of the 1619 Project, here's what you find. It takes as a starting point that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery. So we're teaching in this, and by the way, the 1619 curriculum is being used right here in Missouri. It teaches young people that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery. Oh no. No, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, all those other religious groups, you know, before Great Britain ended slavery, all of New England had ended slavery. That was the first region in the world to end slavery. There never was a time in Massachusetts when blacks could not vote. It's a matter of time. At the time the Constitution was ratified, the northern states, blacks can vote. And in Baltimore, 85% of black folks in Baltimore voted to ratify the Constitution. Kids don't hear that today. So New England was the first area in the world to ban slavery, and it did it long before Great Britain did. By 1804, they had it banned. Great Britain did it in 1833. Then all of America, including the South, did it in 1865. So America was started to protect and preserve slavery, and that the American constitutional system is a source of our society's ills, foremost among them being racism. So if racism is a problem for you, racism is a product of the American constitutional system. That's the source of racism, which means if you want to end racism, you got to get rid of that constitutional system. So that's where you see the hate toward America going, is we got to get rid of what these guys did. The constitutional system, it has to come down. So that's why you see George Washington, President of the Constitutional Convention, he comes down, and notice that on the statue is painted 1619. That's that curriculum. Notice also other statues that come down have 1619 painted on them. And also notice that this statue here, if you can see BLM at the bottom, Black Lives Matter, can you see what the symbol is above it? It's a communist symbol, hammer and sickle. Notice how often BLM has, oops, let me do it again. Notice how often BLM has all these hammer and sickles beside BLM. You see, it's not about racism, it's about destroying America. It's about hating America. I mean, we want a fundamental system. We're going to change this thing from top to bottom. And not that racism doesn't exist. It does. I mean, as long as you got people, you're going to have racism. And it doesn't matter what color. If we were all black or any other color, we would say, yeah, but you got blue eyes, I got brown eyes. We would find a way to not like each other. I mean, that's just what human nature does. We'll find some excuse for that. So hating America, we are teaching that in classrooms. The myth of American exceptionalism is a good example. This is a common textbook in universities. America is not special. America never has been special. America needs to be destroyed. If it's ever going to be set right, we got to destroy it and take it out. It's a myth to think that America was a special nation. This is why last week I was on a White House call. President Trump announced this new initiative, the 1776 Commission, and it's to restore patriotic education, to start at least saying there are good things about America. So, with all statues, where we started this tonight was the fact that we don't put up statues to anybody because they're perfect. We know that nobody's perfect. If you're a Christian, you especially know that. We're told in Romans that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We're also told in Old Testament, New Testament, that there's none righteous, no. We don't put up statues to perfect people. That's not what it is. So who should we celebrate? The people we should celebrate, God gives us good guidance in the Bible in Genesis. In Genesis 6, we're introduced to Noah and his family. Now you remember Adam and Eve, then the family, you got Cain, you got Abel and Cain and Seth, and then Cain kills Abel, and then Lamech kills, and it just keeps going. We just start killing everybody and raping and murdering, taking property and stealing, and God says, I can't do this anymore. Let's wipe them out, start again. And that's where civil government comes in, is in Genesis 9. After they get off the ark, God says, here's 7 laws, the Noahide laws. Here's what you do with murderers. Here's what you do with thieves. So civil government comes as a result of starting the world again. We need a way to govern ourselves and make sure we do what's right. And so that's what we see there. But it's interesting. Why choose Noah? Of all the people that are there, and the Bible tells us in Genesis 6:9, Noah was a righteous man. That's a good reason to choose him. Except that's not what it fully says. It says Noah was a righteous man in his generation. Now what does that mean? Well, if you find in Genesis 9, when Noah got off the ark, he was fall down dead drunk. Got all of his kids in trouble because of his drunkenness. Noah wasn't a perfect man, but was Noah better than all the other people God had to work with at that time? Oh yeah. He wasn't killing anybody. He wasn't raping anybody. He wasn't taking their stuff. He wasn't a perfect guy, but he was so far ahead. And you see, that's the point with statues. These are people that have helped move us in the right direction. Not that they were perfect, but they helped move us in a constitutional direction, or move us toward ending slavery, or move us toward ending Stalin and Hitler, or whatever it is. They moved the world in that direction. And so that's what we understood was in his generation they were significant. May not be in our generation, we would use the same standard. But when you look at what was going on back then, that's the standard. So we have to get back to loving the truth. And to love the truth, we have to find the truth. Now, I'm wrapping up here, but finding the truth is something we haven't had to do in America before. We've trusted the people who told us the truth, or we thought they did, our textbooks, our news commentators, our journalists, our pastors, everybody else. We assumed they were telling us the truth, but now it takes hard work to find the truth. See, we think we know the truth about Columbus. No, we don't. We don't know the truth about most of those statues. We don't even know why they were erected, who they are, or what they did, or what they accomplished. So that means that what we've been doing for the last couple of generations, we've really been coasting. We've been letting other people feed us. And we haven't had to put much work into it. We thought they had good intentions. They're not deliberately misleading us. And so that time is over. You just can no longer accept. Just because it's on Fox News doesn't mean you accept it. Just because it's on CNN doesn't mean you accept it. You don't accept it just because anybody says it. Even Paul, with all his credentials, we don't believe you until we check it out ourselves. And so Columbus is a great example. I'm going to guess that most generations here tonight, including those with white hair like me, didn't get the story of Columbus I just gave you tonight. We used to. Prior to World War II, that's the way we talked about Columbus. That's why we built statues to him, because of what he did to move the world forward. But since World War II, we just kind of gone silent on it, and now we've gone negative on it. So that's the second step. You have to love the truth, but that now means you have to find the truth, and that takes some hard work, hard effort. We're going to have to change our own habits, our own viewing habits, our own trust habits. Well, you can trust Barton. No, you can't. Don't trust me. Go check out everything I've told you. See if I've told you the truth, because if you trust me and I'm wrong, you're in trouble. Because it'll be like believing gravity won't affect you. You will make decisions based on wrong information. You just can't do that. So finding the truth, and the final thing is defending the truth. And this takes courage, and this is something that we know right now in polling Americans don't like doing. We know that 77% of traditional value Americans are now self-centered due to the current climate. If we say Columbus is a good guy, you know like I know that you're going to get attacked. They will come after you because you don't have a chance to explain what you're talking about, and it's going to take some explanation, but we all run on sound bites now. So if I stand up and say Columbus actually is a guy that we should have some respect for because, while not perfect, he did move the world in a good direction. He did help end cannibalism that dominated the Caribbean area. He did save several tribes. He saved thousands of Native Americans, and for that we should celebrate him. If I say that, I'm going to get attacked just like you will. And if I say things in the political climate, or I say things about Congress, or say things about the president, we're going to get in trouble. So what's happened is we've started self-censoring. We're not saying anything, which lets the other side be even louder, which let the next generation think that that's where truth is, because they're the loudest voices out there. And so at some point, we got to remember Revelation 21 says cowards don't have a place in heaven. We just got to get rid of the cowardice. You know, we got to stand up and be willing to get shot at verbally and get yelled at and have bad things said about us. We've got to do that because we have to stand for the truth. So I'm challenging you to think about a redoing of how we've looked at truth. We're just at a different point in American history. And so truth, we have to love the truth, we have to find the truth, and we have to defend the truth. And this should also affect the way that we vote. So the final thing I'll give you tonight, I've done with that part. I want to turn political just for a minute. I want to take you back to the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve created, all of creation created. Why did God create man? Starting in about 1646, what came out in the catechisms, the American catechisms, was that, well, man was created, his chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That's good. That's good reasoning. That's something we should do. But is that what the Bible said about why God created man? The answer is no. That is a good thing to do, but that's not the reason God created man. When you look back to the Bible, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, you see the creation twice. It's like a 30,000-foot view and a 15,000-foot view. Each chapter covers creation. Start with the firmament is divided and separate the waters above from waters below, and then separate the land from the waters. Put the greater sky to rule the day, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. Then you have the ocean and the fish in the ocean. Then you have the plants and the animals. And God gets all of creation made. And so what we find in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, it's interesting to see what God did after he finished creation. He looked at it and said, it's all really good. And then the Bible tells us in Genesis 2:5 and 2:15, says God looked and saw he had no one to tend his garden. So he made man. So the reason God created man was to take care of his stuff. Literally, it was to tend the garden. Now, the way we know Scripture, the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. Everything is his. The way that evangelicalism talks about it today is we talk about the 7 mountains, that all of these belong to God. Yep, we're supposed to be tending his stuff. We should never have gotten Christians out of media. Did you know that until 1968, no film came out in Hollywood unless pastors approved it? And in 1968, pastors said, we don't want to be involved with secular stuff. So how's that worked out for us? Say we've gotten out of education, we've gotten out of science, we've gotten out of politics, we've gotten out of everything. We're not tending his garden very well. It's got a lot of weeds growing, and we should have been tending his garden because we're still a majority in this nation, have been all the way through. So when it comes to tending the garden, one of those 7 mountains is the mountain of government. And tending the garden happens when we vote. Right now, in every presidential election since 1980, only 36% of American adults vote in the presidential election. Every election since 1980 has been decided, but 36% only takes half of that to win, it's 18%. Only 1 out of 5 Americans chooses the President of the United States since 1980. It is so easy to take Congress in different directions, state legislature, city councils. We just got to get above that 36%. That's not their fault, that's our fault. We're just not tending the garden very well. So that's what I challenge you with. Election 2020 is a great opportunity to tend the garden. There's a good chance from the local level, state level, federal level. We need to get back involved in this thing. Thank you guys for letting me share with you. Haven.
Okay, if any of you had questions, if you want to write them on those cards, and we'll throw a few questions at him. I don't know how much time we have, but okay, we've got some time for some questions. So, Natalie, Ron, do you want to help collect cards for me?
By the way, we just came out at WallBuilders with a brand new book. We started writing it 3 years ago. It's called The American Story. We had no clue when we wrote it 3 years ago that deals with all these statues being torn down, all the stuff, the story behind it. It deals with Columbus extensively. It deals with Puritans and Pilgrims, slavery in America, when it got started, how it got ended. All of that stuff that we're debating today, we were just telling God's stories of heroes. So many of the black heroes I mentioned earlier that we don't tell their stories anymore. So if you're interested in having a good view of American history, the way we used to teach it, over on the tables, The American Story. Also, the Founders Bible is over there. Founders Bible, we literally take Bible verses and Founding Fathers' writings to show what was built off that. John Adams has 3 letters saying that they did separation of powers based on Jeremiah 17:9. So the Bible had a huge direct influence. So that's available. There's an app online. If you want to get the Founders Bible online, we have other apps as well. And there's lots of materials and lots of books. So there's stuff there, or you can go to wallbuilders.com. Haven?
Okay, we've got one good question here. Would the Democrats' attitude about blacks in the 1800s explain why they treated the Native American Indians the way they did?
I don't think there's a good explanation for that, frankly. And if you don't know, it's interesting, the Republican Party got started in May of 1854 after a vote in the House. And in the House of Representatives, you had so many parties at the time. There weren't 2 parties. You had the Emancipationists, the Free Soilers, you had the Whigs, you had the Democrats, you had all these different parties. And the Whigs is the early form of the Republicans, except they just went silent on moral values. They wouldn't take a moral stand. And so a lot of the Whigs that were anti-slavery, like John Quincy Adams type and like Daniel Webster type, there was a vote that happened first in 1850. The Democrats became a majority party in 1820. And in 1820, they became a majority party. They were openly pro-slavery at the time. And so what they did was they started repealing anti-slavery laws. One of the anti-slavery laws had been signed by George Washington in 1789. That anti-slavery law said no new territory coming to the United States can have slavery of any kind. We've got the southern slave states, and we want slavery gone, and so no new state comes in with slavery. So you had all these states coming in, Indiana, Ohio, you had Illinois, states coming in that were anti-slavery. And the Democrats got a majority in 1820 and said, well, that's not fair because our guys in the South are Democrats and they're outnumbered and that's just not good. It needs to be equal. So they went back, and in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, they repealed the George Washington Law of 1789 and said from now on, states come in pairs. Every time a pro-slavery state, anti-slavery state comes in, you got to have a pro-slavery state. So in 1820, here comes Missouri, but they were attached to Maine. Missouri was considered at that time a slave state. Maine was an anti-slavery state. So after 1820, they come in pairs. Throughout that period of time, Democrats write openly in their platform of their support for slavery. They say that this is a blessing for America. It is a blessing to have slaves. It's a blessing to be in slavery. If you're a black person, this is a blessing for you. So look how it could have been if you were in Africa. You're here in America in slavery. That's so much better than Africa. It's just twisted thinking. So it goes that way. 1850, because the anti-slavery side is rising, you have the Great Awakening, First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, and out of that comes huge biblical sentiments of equality. God created all men equal. God doesn't look on the outside. Acts 17:26, He made us all from one man. So the view of equality, as the revivals grew, the toleration for slavery went down far. And so the Democrats found themselves having less and less influence as more and more abolitionists came into Congress, like John Quincy Adams. So what they did in 1850, they passed the Fugitive Slave Law. The Fugitive Slave Law said, it's really not fair that we ban the slave trade, and it's really not fair that all these states are becoming anti-slavery, because for our brothers in the South, they can't get slaves the way they used to get slaves. So we need to be able to have another way to get slaves. So the Fugitive Slave Law said, if you're a slave owner from anywhere, you can go into any other state in the United States. You can point at a black person or a white person. You can point at any person and say, you used to be my slave. At that point, three things happen legally. Just point at me and say, I used to be your slave. At that point, I am not allowed to have an attorney represent me. I do not get a trial by jury, and I do not get the right of habeas corpus. Right of habeas corpus means they can't throw you in jail and leave you there until they figure out what they want to charge you with. They got to keep you out of jail until they got something specific. So they accuse me of being a slave, so I go to jail, and I sit in jail, and I can't say, wait a minute, I've always been free. My neighbors know that. Here's my papers. None of that matters. I go before a federal magistrate, and according to the federal law, the federal magistrate says, the law says that if the federal magistrate rules that I was indeed a slave and I should go to slavery in the South, at that point, the federal magistrate gets paid $10 for that ruling. But if he rules that I was never a slave, I'm not a slave, I'm free, I'm not going into slavery in the South, he only gets paid $5. So guess how the decisions went? So suddenly, we've got a stream of people coming out of the North, free blacks going into slavery in the South, to feed the slave stuff there. That's what really started the Underground Railroad, was you got to get slaves out of America. So we went to Canada and other places, because even if you're in Boston, always been free, they walk in and say, you used to be my slave. He says he was your slave, you get $10, now you can take him to Georgia or wherever. So that's an onerous law. At that point in time, pastors all over America started telling their congregations, disobey that law, civil disobedience. If it comes before you, if a jury comes before you, and the northern judges tried to let them have jury trials even though they weren't supposed to, the juries were turning loose all these guys because this was just a sham. So that resulted in 1854 in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas-Nebraska territory at that time went essentially from Oklahoma up into Canada. So Democrats said, we want slavery in there, which goes slavery now from Miami to Toronto, essentially. We're going coast to coast with slavery. And at that point, 20 anti-slavery Democrats, Charles Sumner and others, Whigs like Charles Sumner, joined with the Whigs, joined with the Free Soilers and Emancipationists, and formed the Republican Party in May of 1854 as a result of that act. At that point in time, with the Republican Party being started as an anti-slavery party, I have its original platform. There were only 9 planks, and 7 of the 9 were we're going to end slavery, we're going to give equality, everybody's going to be equal protection of the law. So Democrats had that split. When Abraham Lincoln gets elected in 1860 as the first Republican president, he ran on that platform, embraced it. The platform of 1860 had 17 planks, and it was more anti-slavery stuff. He embraced that. Before he was sworn in, the Democrats from the South said, we're leaving Congress. We can't be part of any nation. We believe he's going to do what he said, and he's going to end slavery. We're not going to be part of that nation. That was the split. We call it the South and the North. It was not the South and the North. It was Democrats. The Northern Democrats that did not go were largely in New York. They were called Union Democrats. They believed in slavery. They didn't believe you should split the Union. So the Union is, if you want to read the records of Congress, every Southern Democrat gives a farewell speech in Congress, House and Senate both. They're all going, and they formed the Confederate States of America, which they officially called the slaveholding Confederate States of America. A provision of the Confederate Constitution said you cannot be part of the Confederacy unless you believe in the blessings and the perpetuation of slavery. You couldn't get you couldn't be a Southern state and get in if you were anti-slavery. So that's what Democrats did. Finally, the war ends that. Democrats are allowed to come back. But now, because of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in 1865, which, by the way, 100% of Republicans voted to abolish slavery. Only 19% of Democrats voted to abolish slavery in that Civil Rights Amendment. The 14th Amendment, which gave all blacks equal civil rights, not a single Democrat voted for the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. Not a single Democrat voted for the 15th Amendment. So they were passed by Republicans. At that point in time, you now have blacks able to serve in office, federal office. So the first 22 blacks elected to the U.S. Congress were all Republican. In Texas, my state, the first 41 blacks elected to office in Texas were all Republican. The Republican Party of Texas was started July the 4th, 1866 by 150 blacks and 20 whites. The South Carolina Republican Party started by a black man, Robert Smalls. The Southern Republican Party is all started by blacks. The first 137 blacks to serve in Louisiana were all Republicans. The first 190 blacks to serve in South Carolina were all Republicans. On through it goes. So it's interesting to me with all this history today, Democrats say Republicans are racist, just like Chris Wallace threw in Trump's face the other night. Are you going to announce white supremacists? No, that's the other party you're talking about. It's not the Republicans that have the white supremacists. And so that's part of the background. I can't explain how they get away with that, and I can't explain because we're so historically illiterate. We don't know even the political history of America. Now, I'm not going to say today that the Democrats are pro-slavery. I think they are wrong in so many other areas, but there's no denying the history of who they were. And so that's one of the things they like. They call it the Great Switch. Oh, all the Republicans in the South are now the racists that Democrats used to be, and racists are all good guys, and Republicans are all the old Democrat racists. Nonsense. That's so easy to disprove. But again, long answer to a short question, just so you know some of the background. Again, we don't teach history very well. That's why going back and looking at original documents does really well. But there's no way that anybody who has any kind of degree of education, and I don't mean a degree in, I mean any degree, any amount of education, we should know this about our own country, about the history of parties, and we should never let media or anybody else get away with making the comparisons they get away with. But people are silent again because we just don't know our history.
Okay. Why did Americans tolerate Woodrow Wilson's false history book, and what history book would you suggest now that we can give our children?
Woodrow Wilson, nobody really paid attention to his history book. They were looking at all his other accolades. Woodrow Wilson is the epitome of the rise of the progressive movement. Progressive movement started back in the 1880s. And by the way, the Christian churches had some failures along the way. When Darwin did his Origin of Species in 1859, that was science that says man evolved. He wasn't created. It created a huge confusion in the Christian church. For the next 20 years, there's big debates in the Christian church. Oh my gosh, science says that we're evolved. God says we're created. I don't know. What do we do with this conflict? And so there was a major split of denominations in about 1879. Several denominations said, look, we don't know what to do with science. We don't know, and we just don't understand that, but we do know that Jesus wants everybody to be saved, so we're going to get everybody saved. They became known as the evangelicals. Now, evangelical means something different today, but they were going to evangelize everyone. The remaining churches said no. The Bible is fundamental to all aspects of life. It's fundamental science. This science of Darwin's will be proven wrong because the Bible is right. And they became known as the fundamentalists, and they believed that fundamentalist Bible guides everything. So then what happens is you've now taken half the Christians out of the debate because they're not going to get involved in politics or education or anything else. They're just going to get people saved. So we have backed away from that. At the same time, you have people like Robert Ingersoll, who's known as the National Atheist of Evangelism, back in the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s saying, we have got to get religion out of America. And so he convened conferences of secularists in that day, and they said, here's the plan we need to lay out. Now, Ingersoll explained that the plan they laid out on how to secularize America, he said it might take 80 years. He said, we're all going to be done by that time, but the results of it would be so good that it's worth doing. And so they started that plan, and that's what really caused progressives to rise in education and theology, in so many areas, and that's where the progressive movement really got started in the 1920s. It comes to power. That's when they start taking Harvard Law School. That's when they start taking, I say 20s, leading up to 20s. But Harvard Law School, they get justices on the Supreme Court, they get governors. Teddy Roosevelt in that period becomes a progressive. So the progressive move is really, really growing at that point, and that's where Woodrow Wilson comes in. He's a great academic, president of Princeton University. Oh my gosh, he's great. He's progressive. We all want to move forward. We don't want to be trapped in the past. And so nobody was really aware of their philosophies, just their rhetoric, and they wanted to progress and move forward. Who wants to be chained to the past? So Woodrow Wilson gets in largely because of the credentials and not because anybody paid much attention to what he had written. As you go through that book today, even hardcore Democrats would have a tough time defending Wilson and his views back then. But again, most of us don't know what that book was about. Most people haven't taken the time to read 5 volumes of The American People, which is a piece of trash. And because of that, we just kind of blow it off. So that's, again, a thing where that we've been coasting for a good while. We've just been accepting good intentions, assuming people want the best. You just can't make that assumption anymore.
Okay, what about California passing a law to consider reparations for slavery? Would you comment on that?
Yeah, California passed a law to consider reparations for slavery. I want to see what happens when they find out that a high percentage of blacks own slaves and a high percentage of Native Americans own slaves, and that whites were also slaves. The first slave law in America was 1871. It allowed you to own blacks or whites or Indians, all 3. So if they're going to do reparations, it means we're all going to get a check at some point in some way. As soon as they find out the rest of their history. Now, the problem with their history is they don't pay attention to it anymore, and so this thing will invariably end up in court because somebody like me will say, I want my reparations because my family was in slavery and wherever it was. And so there's going to be a lot of stuff coming out on that. It's going to be a hard thing to work out for sure. It's the politically correct thing to do for progressives, but like their other policies, it doesn't make any common sense, which is why it'll eventually fall.
Okay, this is a little bit different. On the radio program with Glenn Beck, you talked about the NRA being used to arm and train former slaves. Snopes calls the claim false because the NRA website doesn't refer to that part of their history. What is the true story of the NRA, and why would arming former slaves be kept secret in the 1870s?
Yeah, arming former slaves was important. As a matter of fact, you find several of the black officers, Robert Smalls and others, Christian Fleetwood, several of these guys went back and armed the black communities. One of the first laws, the reason the 14th Amendment had to be passed was southern states said, well, blacks may be free, but you know what? You don't get the right to keep and bear arms. Now, we do, but you don't. And by the way, you don't get the right to a trial by jury. And so the southern states were letting blacks be free because of the 13th Amendment, but giving them no civil rights at all. And because they could not defend themselves is why the 14th Amendment, one of the reasons the 14th Amendment was passed. There was also many other reasons. And by the way, Snopes, I mean, that is one of the biggest jokes out there. Somebody needs to do a Snopes on Snoops because they, well, we got it off Wikipedia, and they said, yeah, Wikipedia, right, exactly. So you'll find that some of the, 2 of the white Civil War generals also believed that blacks needed to be armed to go back into the South against all, because in the South there was a standing order that any black that ever surrendered was to be killed on the spot. There was no consideration of terms of war. That's the Fort Pillow Massacre. Fort Pillow Massacre was conducted by General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. So these white generals, 2 of them particularly, said, you guys have got to be able to defend yourself when you go back into your states. So that was a big issue for them, was the right of self-defense. And because no liberal progressive historians have written about it, that is a false claim, according to Snopes. No, there's lots of stuff back there to show how bad it was and how blacks needed to defend themselves at that point in time. As a matter of fact, the Republican Convention of Louisiana in 1867, Democrats attacked the convention and killed 120 blacks and 35 whites. I forget the exact numbers, but in the South, the Democrats were attacking Republican conventions and killing those at the conventions, and that's part of the reason why they needed guns to be able to defend themselves. NRA, National Rifle Association, was one of the organizations started in that period of time in Reconstruction to get people armed and familiar with guns and how to use them.
Do you want to speak to some of your literature, because people are asking what sources should we go to so that we can speak intelligently on these issues? And do you have things, or do you recommend other sources?
Yeah, let me give you some advice that we give the young people. If someone comes to you and says, whatever, prove it, let me set it up differently. They come to you and say, you're wrong, here's what the truth is. Say, prove it. See, they want us to prove stuff all the time, and they chase us around making us answer their questions. This is where Jesus turned around and asked them questions back. When they came to him and said, Jesus, by whose authority do you do this? He said, well, let me ask you a question. John's baptism, was it of God or was it of men? Shut up the Pharisees, because they didn't want to answer the question. So what we teach these young people to do is ask questions back. Answer a question with a question. So when people make claims on the left, put it back at them. Ask them a question. Where's your evidence? Where's your proof? Where'd you get that? Here's a good example. We got a text from a young person who had been through the training, and this young person in the text it was a random text, came out of nowhere. I forget what we were doing, but the text came in and it says, were the founding fathers all raging alcoholics? And we sent back a little smiley face, ha ha ha, very funny. By the way, why did you ask? Because we thought he's just horsing around, just a joke. He said, well, my professor just said that all the founding fathers were raging alcoholics. I don't think that's right, but I don't know. What do I do? And so once we figured out it's a real thing, then right back say, okay, first off, don't challenge your professor at all. Don't take them on. Don't cause them to have to use their authority. But go back and tell your professor, that was so interesting what you told about the founding fathers being raging alcoholics. I'd never heard that before. I want to learn more about that. Where can I go to get more information on that? Ask the professor that. Professor said, I think the only time I've ever seen that mentioned was when it was in an article on Huffington Post. And she heard herself say that. That's not real good academic study. So sends back the answer. She said Huffington Post, and say, well, point out to your professor, I read the article, but they didn't have any footnotes there. I want to go back to the sources. I want to see where this got started. I mean, the Huffington Post article, where can you send me to get some original sources on this? And she said, well, the only other place I've seen this is I think that the History Channel had a 1-hour special on this one time. And the kid said, yeah, but there's no footnotes there. And she said, I guess I shouldn't have said that, should I? Bingo. See, part of what you do is you just start asking questions back to them. Don't feel obliged to answer questions that they ask us. Answer questions make them prove their thesis. They're attacking us, believing their thesis is right. We've got to defend our thesis. Make them defend their thesis. Put it back on them. Now, once they find out that I got it off CNN. Oh, great. That's a great place to get it. Well, Jake Tapper said, well, good for him. Where's your authoritative source? And see, what you do is you start putting it back on them to find evidence for their position that is genuine evidence that would be accepted in a court of law. If there was a jury sitting right there, convince a jury. They have a hard time doing that, but we don't challenge them to that. We feel like we have a moral obligation to answer every question somebody asks. We don't. We ought to be asking questions back to them, making them defend their views, making them show where it comes from. So that's what I would recommend on that question.
Okay, I think one more. This is a two-part question. Are you on the 1776 Commission? And are your diaries digitized, or do you plan on digitizing them?
Is what digitized?
all your diaries and journals so that we can access them on the WallBuilders website?
Good questions. Okay, I'm not on the 1776 Commission. Don't know who's on it yet. There's, as far as we know, it's not all set yet. There's more to be done. There'll be initial stuff going on that, so we'll see. I'm not on that. As far as what we have, we are trying our best to digitize and get as much original stuff up online as we can. We are actually have a program with volunteers who will volunteer time to digitize stuff. But I will say right now that there are a number of sources in the United States that are phenomenal and have taken millions of original documents and digitized them. I'll give you one. Books.google.com, Google Books, books.google.com. They have taken entire books of founding fathers in Columbus, that 3-volume set of Columbus. You can read it online. You can download it as a PDF and print it if you want to. But they have the entire book scanned and up there. So Google Books is a great source. Archives.org is another one that has hundreds of thousands of original documents where you can just print them off and see them, the original handwritten documents. We have a link on our website, wallbuilders.com, to a list of a lot of Rutgers University actually has a rare book area that is very, very good. Same with Yale. Yale may be wrong in a lot of areas, but they have taken the collection they have of early writings and put it online. So there's a lot of sources now where you can go to the actual original. And when you see it, it's pretty impressive. So we're in the process of getting what we have up there. We have a lot of stuff that's in no other person's collection, so we're getting that up there. We've got a lot of volunteers coming in to help us do that. I also help run a collection for Glenn Beck, where we have so many more things over there. So between that collection and ours, we're in the process of trying to get a huge place raised in Dallas, built in Dallas, that would be like a Disneyland for history, where that Disneyland, you know, you go through Disneyland, you have the fun rides and whatever. So you go through this, in Disneyland, as you go through the rides, they have little videos running showing, then you get the ride. Ours is kind of reversed. And as, let's say a D-Day ride, what you're going through, you see all the stuff from D-Day. You see all the actual stuff that was there at D-Day. And the D-Day ride is, we have the new technology that's out now with virtual reality technology, puts you in the middle of stuff. So we'll let kids choose whether they want to be part of the invasion on D-Day or whether they want to be at the Alamo or be on a stagecoach being attacked by outlaws. So we'll take them through all aspects of history and then let them experience it, because when you can use your imagination, it changes the way you see history. So much of what we have in our collection, we let young people handle the things. They hold guns from the Revolution, hold cannons, and hold other things. And then you start imagining, what would it have been like if I'd been there? Exactly. Once you start imagining, then it gets really interesting, and now you start getting into it. The other thing that we encourage, if you look at the way the Bible covers history, take the history of David and Goliath. You can't tell me what year David killed Goliath because it's not in the Bible, because it really wasn't that important. What was important was the story of what happened, not the date when it happened. So in America, as we got the progressives, they moved into facts, dates, names, places. God is into stories. And so the way we used to learn American history was, if you wanted to learn the American Revolution, you read the biography of George Washington and of Abigail Adams and of Wentworth Cheswell and of all these other folks. And as you read their stories, you go, oh my gosh, I can imagine being there. That would have been really tough. As you go through it, now you start connecting. You start making personal lessons. But by finding out that D-Day occurred on June the 6th, 1944, there's nothing that changes my life on that. That's a cool story. But if I start seeing the stories of guys who went on the beach that day and what they did and what they went through, that'll change my life. So that's what we also emphasize, is a lot of biographies in history, and that's the way history had been. So you can go online to Google Books, read old biographies. I kind of recommend that when you're reading old biographies, don't read anything prior to 1880 in the way of biography if you can, because that's when progressives started getting an education and having an agenda that wasn't truth. By about 1900, I trust about 80% of the books I read before 1900. When I get to 1920, it's down about 60%. When I get to 1945, we're down around, I trust maybe 35%. And after 1980, it's pretty iffy because agendas get in. So that's what I would recommend. But we have a lot of that WallBuilders on the website, links that'll go to those sites so you can get your hands on original documents. Fun stuff. By the way, if you have young people 18 through 25, we'd love to have them next summer, train them in this kind of stuff, get them equipped. They will go back and tear up the next generation. It's really good what I see them doing. It's really good.
Let's give David a hand. That was awesome.